Okay, hello, welcome back. I hope you were able to stretch and take a little bit of a break. So let's jump back in here. We finished up the last video with the different types of trauma, right? And which can occur from abuse or not. Just the exposure to different incidents can create the trauma. Kids being abandoned by their parents is extremely traumatic. That leads to the emotional trauma and all of that, okay? So now let's take a look at, when we discuss the different types of trauma, now let's take a look at how trauma has an effect on the individual, okay? So on the kiddo or on the adult. And keep in mind again, when we are talking about trauma, just keep in mind the foundation we laid in the different types of trauma, okay? So this is true of the different types of trauma, okay? How it affects the individual. First is cognition, okay? When we say cognition, we're talking about the thought process, okay? So our thought processes. So trauma has an effect on the way the child thinks, how, and we have what we call schemas, okay? So a schema is like a structure within our cognition of how we think about ourselves, about other people, and about the world, okay? So, and the trauma also has a negative effect on neurological development, okay? And this is significant. In fact, the most recent research that involving neurological development with infants, toddlers, children, there's a significant impact on the development of the human brain when trauma has occurred, okay? Physical trauma, sexual trauma, emotional trauma, verbal trauma, and abandonment if the child has been abandoned and they are experiencing that emotional trauma. So this is very powerful right here, okay? The cognition is how we develop our sense of ourselves, what we think about ourselves, we think about other people and the world around us. So our perception, okay? So if you have our thought processes that have become skewed, and the young person, the child, has experienced trauma, then their perception of other people and themselves and the world is going to be very negative, and they're going to have a real difficult time with their own thought process, okay? We will come back around to this. The neurological development, as I said, research has really looked at the impact that trauma has on the brain. In fact, even with adults, studies have been done, like veterans of war who have been in a theater of war. They have done research looking at specific parts of the brain, and the hippocampus in particular, part of the brain which it has to do with memory, emotions, things like that. Actually, they have seen a shrinkage within that region of the brain. So that's just one example. But when you have a child whose brain is developing, this becomes very concerning, because there are problems here that have been interfered with the trauma. So physical. So trauma has an effect on the physical well-being, the physical body, okay? So we call this physiological, So the trauma has affected the way the child experiences within their own body. What do I mean by that? Well, we have this, I'm sure you know, is the fight or flight, right? So it's a physiological response. If someone's in danger, if you're in danger, you're either going to fight or you're going to run for your life, okay? So that's the autonomic, nervous system. So we have that nervous system that cranks up, and when danger happens, when we're fearful or in a scary situation, if a child is in a very scary situation, they've been exposed to violence, they've witnessed violence, they've experienced some sort of abuse, their body is going to respond to that. So the autonomic nervous system, so think of it autonomic, right, is broken down into two different parts. We have the somatic, okay, somatic, or autonomic, okay? All right. So the autonomic, and I hope you all can see this, that's the part of the physiological that there's that automatic response when there's danger, okay? And this is very relevant and very important for us to understand, because the autonomic has a parasympathetic, left out my M, so parasymp, or the sympathetic, S-Y-M-P-A-T-H-E, okay, sympathetic. Okay, so the physiological response in the body when there is the trauma, initial trauma that's happened, the parasympathetic is when we're really relaxed and we're calm and we're laying on the sofa or resting and we're all calm, there's no danger. But the moment the threat comes in, the sympathetic nervous system is now activated, okay? So the sympathetic nervous system is now activated when there is trauma, some sort of threat, okay? So when the sympathetic nervous system is activated, like I said, it's that fight or flight. You're gonna run or you're gonna fight, but there's also another part to this. When that sympathetic nervous system is activated, we also call it freezing, okay? So remember that word, freeze. That simply means that if the young person, and this is actually more prevalent with children when they are traumatized, because they're not big, like the big adults who can fight or run away. A child will go into a mode of just kind of freezing, sort of like if you've ever heard the saying, a deer in the headlights. If a deer runs across the road and you're driving, they're going to stop and just freeze and look at you because they don't know what to do. That's what children will do, especially with sexual abuse. And the freezing part is where they just kind of go into a place of actually disconnecting, and in their mind they just kind of disconnect, okay? And so they really, it's just a way for them to deal with the trauma and what's happening in that moment. But this will come up again. Okay, and let me explain why this is so important. And I know I take some time here, because especially for you folks who are helping children and young people coming through traumas, physical traumas, sexual traumas, this is really important because we forget about the body and the body's response to trauma. Here's the problem, okay? So when a person is experiencing trauma, let's say a physical or a sexual assault, okay? So whether it's a child or an adult, they experience that sexual assault and their sympathetic nervous system is activated, okay? So pupils are dilated, heart rate is going, you know, all of this is happening within their body, okay? But here's where the real problem is. So now post-trauma, okay, so after the trauma, the individual will continue to experience that physiological response from the sympathetic nervous system, okay? How does that happen? Well, interestingly, those memories, the memory of that initial incident has created what we call an emotional memory, okay? So the memory is there, but the emotion, the fear, the terror, all of that that's behind that memory will now trigger that physiological response. And so the heart will start racing, pupils dilated, sweating, sick to the stomach, all of that will occur even after the event. In fact, we see this as part of post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. All it takes is the memory to you know, be activated. It can come from any sort of trigger. And when I say a trigger, I mean something that reminds that individual of that incident, okay? And so that memory, the emotion behind it, and now the physiological response. In fact, when I'm working with patients who have experienced traumas and sexual traumas, I tell them that, you know, the memory of it is not not the problem. It's not what's causing them the problems. It's actually the physiological responses and the emotions that they're experiencing resulting from that memory, okay? Memories, we can't wipe out memories, and that's not our objective anyway. We learn, we grow. Goodness, trauma, the memories that I have from things I walked through, now I use those memories to help other people, and you know, it helps me be able to connect and help other people. But the emotional part of that is healed, and the physiological responses are no longer activated, okay? So I really wanted to spend some time on this. It's so important that you understand this because, again, that young person is experiencing something in their body, and adults. I don't want to exclude, I mean, this applies to adults as well. I see plenty of men and women, particularly women, who are re-experiencing a trauma because of the emotion that's there and the physiological response to that, okay? And that's the part where I really work with patients to help them as they can overcome that. Now, and I will get to that, and we'll get to how we address these different areas. How do we help in these different areas? And we're going to address that in our next video, okay? So for now, I want you to realize that the body is so powerful, we can't leave that out, okay? So we have cognition that's affected by trauma, so the thought processes, all of that influence our perception of other people, of the world, of ourselves, okay? So that cognition, the neurological development that we see in the brain, okay? And the physical, the physiological, which is affects the sympathetic nervous system, okay? And the next one is emotional, feelings, okay? So trauma affects our emotions, our feelings. And when you have young people who have been exposed to traumas and have gone through these things, they get very good at, we'll just say, shutting down those emotions. Adults are great at it too, don't get me wrong. I mean, I've worked with plenty of adults, women, who have just shut down those emotions. And young people can become very good at it too. Why is this problematic? Well, because if they don't learn to feel, if they shut those feelings down, then we really can't help them to heal and to move past that, right? Emotions are God-given. We are emotional beings. We feel all these different feelings that, God has given us. So we feel sadness, we feel happiness, we feel anger, and within the different emotions, there are different levels within these emotions, right? So maybe I'm a little, happy, maybe I'm smiley, or maybe I'm like, wow, I'm so excited, I'm off the charts, yay! So there's different levels of these emotions. Or the sadness, maybe I feel a little melancholy, a little sad, or maybe I'm severely depressed and deeply sad, okay? So kids, when we're helping kids, it's important that we're helping them identify how the trauma has affected their feelings, okay? Their emotions. So if you have a child who has, let's say, been abandoned by the parents or been left or hurt by family, those emotions are going to be very strong. Sadness, anger, a lot of anger. In fact, I see two different types of people usually when it comes to these emotions as a result of trauma. One is an individual who is so angry. A kid is like so angry and in fights and getting in fights and maybe pushing back against adults, breaking rules, not wanting to follow directions. Okay, so that's a kid who's out there with it. The other one goes in, kind of like what we had talked about before. They're inward, so they're going to go deep into a sadness. They're going to go into this place of despair. That kid is more difficult to reach, again, because they have gone into the shell, and we have to work to help them get out of that place. The kid who's all out there and they're putting it out there, well, there's no guessing where they're at, right? So, they let us know. There's no guesswork there. Okay. So like I said, we're going to come back around in our next video and talk about how we begin to help in these different areas, okay? So the last one is spiritual, okay? Faith-based. And, we often, especially those of us who are in the field, I am a very strong believer, in the Lord. My faith is most important to me. I love the Lord with all my heart, and I am a psychologist, a clinical psychologist. Well, there are a lot of clinical psychologists in this field who do not have a relationship with the Lord, and unfortunately, they will often leave this piece out, which is very, very sad to me. And when I teach my students at the university, I strongly advise them to never leave this out, because children know there is a God, and every kid I've worked with, I am so amazed at their knowledge, this God-given knowledge within their heart about God. I had that when I was a little girl, and I grew up in an atheist home and had no exposure. But I remember at a tender young age, 7, 8 years old, saying a prayer asking God to help me. Where did that come from? Well, it's written on our hearts, right? So, and the reason this is so important, and I tell my students this, because when there's nobody else to blame, oftentimes the individual wants to place the blame right here on God. because who else is there to blame, right? I see this over and over with adults, but I see this with kids too. It's heartbreaking to me. In fact, I'll tell you a story about a family I was seeing. They came in, I was working in a community clinic, low-cost community clinic, and I started seeing these kids. The mother brought them in, and they had experienced terrible trauma from their father. He would physically abuse them terribly, put them in a hot shower, and just terrible things. And unfortunately, this father was also supposedly a person of faith, would take them to church on Sunday, and well, he clearly wasn't. But the kids connected that trauma to God. And the one little boy, he was, I want to say 10 or 11, he had already determined that he was going to be an atheist. Because how could there be a God who would allow those kinds of things to happen, okay? So that's a tragedy, but you will see this, okay? Because like I said, if there's nowhere else we can place the blame, then God, this God of the universe, he should have been able to stop this. And even kids who are not exposed to the faith per se, the Christian faith, biblical faith, they still, with this thought of God, this out there, this being of the universe, why would he allow this to happen, okay? And so this can be a real tough one. And when I'm teaching my students about this, and how we help children with trauma, it's really important that we get a sense of where they're at and how they feel about God in light of what they've been exposed to, okay? So, but when we come back around to our next video, I will help you with that. I have seen some very effective ways in which we approach this and help the kids, okay? So there it is. These are the different areas that the individual, that child and adult, are affected by trauma. And it's important for us to remember that God has created us as this incredible person. Okay, so we have a thinking mind, we have a brain, that we have cognition and thought process. We have this amazing physical body that we experience sensations. We have feelings. God gave us this capacity to have all these amazing emotions. And we have this precious part of us, our spirit being, and that spiritual, that faith connection with our God in heaven, right? If we are being affected in our body and we're re-experiencing traumas, if those kiddos are re-experiencing trauma and they're feeling it physically, that's going to affect them emotionally. It's going to affect their thoughts, okay, and fears and all of that. Or let's say in their cognition, in their thinking and their perception that the world is not safe, people are not safe, right? That's going to affect them emotionally. It's going to make them sad, angry, terrified. It's going to affect their body, how their body feels. In fact, children will experience tummy aches. They'll have stomach aches. They'll tell you they have a headache or this or that hurts. Okay, that's the physiological response that they're experiencing, right? And again, affecting their faith and their spiritual well-being. Okay, so we're going to conclude right now. We are just a little bit over 24 minutes, almost 25 minutes on video number 2 here. So I'm going to step away. If you want to take a photo of the board or write anything down, I'm just going to say that we have, again, the nervous system, remember? So let me write nervous system. Okay, The nervous system is made up of the somatic and autonomic, okay? And we're not worrying about the somatic right now. We're talking about the autonomic, which has two branches, two parts to it, which is the parasympathetic and the sympathetic. The one that we're concerning ourselves with when it comes to trauma is the sympathetic, okay? So when an individual is experiencing that anxiety in their body, they're experiencing these different feelings, they're being triggered from the trauma, a physiological response becomes the sympathetic. Everything is, it's the fight or flight, or they go into a freeze, okay? Parasympathetic is what we want to get them to, where they're calming back down, okay? Okay, so that's it. Concludes our video number 2. Take a break, go stretch your legs, get something to drink, and we'll be back.